Hi everyone. This video is going to look at the role of cannabis in the cause and treatment of psychosis. So these are movie posters from the 1930s movie Reefer Madness, and you can probably see that the idea behind this was that cannabis was not a good thing, and that cannabis caused people to lose their mind and do bad things. So this movie was actually sponsored originally by a religious organization, and so while what you see here may not represent the general population's perception of cannabis at the time, it at least represents what a portion of the population thought. And certainly other people might have questioned what was true and wasn't true. In reality, the movie that best represents cannabis and psychosis is It's Complicated, because you're going to see that there is no clear connection, but there is also. It depends on whether you're talking about acute psychosis or long-term psychosis. And so when we look at this, we're going to look at four primary questions. First is, does cannabis use cause psychosis? In terms of psychosis, does it cause acute psychosis? And does it cause persistent psychosis? With persistent psychosis, does when the cannabis was consumed matter? Does it matter whether there's an adult that it has persistent cannabis consumption leading to psychosis? Does it matter whether there's an adolescent that had persistent or long-term cannabis use that led to persistent psychosis in adulthood? And then finally, can we use cannabis or related compounds to treat psychosis? So it is well known and has long been known that cannabis use causes acute psychosis. And by that, we mean paranoia, hallucinations, delusions, just general bad feelings and imagining things that aren't actually true. We've seen that if you inject THC directly into a patient, that it is going to have a similar effect to that. And not only that, but if you then gave this patient an antipsychotic medication, which is usually a dopamine receptor antagonist, that you can't block this effect. You can't take a person who is suffering from psychosis due to this THC and bring them back out of psychosis. And not only that, but if you have a patient that is already on antipsychotic medication, that doesn't prevent psychosis, which is confusing, because what this likely means is that the route or the mechanism that THC is working through to cause psychosis is different than the psychosis that we are familiar with. And as of now, what that mechanism isn't really clear. And to make things more complicated, not all people who use cannabis or THC suffer from these psychotic side effects. In fact, there are many people, and perhaps most people, that don't. However, in some people, it can be very, very severe. It appears that perhaps one of the causes or determinants in determining who is going to suffer from these side effects is a polymorphism in the catechol O-methyltransferase enzyme. So this is a drug metabolizing enzyme. Perhaps this is leading to a change in metabolism of THC. It's either causing a buildup of a particular molecule or it's causing the production of a different molecule where the general population may not do that. Big picture, if we look at what THC does in the brain, it causes what we call neural noise in the hippocampus. So this is essentially aberrant, that's the word I'm looking for, aberrant neuron firing, or still can't think, action potentials. It's causing aberrant action potentials that are firing when they shouldn't be firing. And so this kind of end result mimics what we see in schizophrenia. So schizophrenics suffer from the same neural noise in the hippocampus. So the end result of standard psychosis and THC-induced psychosis is the same, but it's likely that they're somehow getting to the same point through different routes. What about persistent psychosis? If we look at correlations between cannabis use and psychosis, we see a very strong correlation. If we look at people who use cannabis occasionally, there's a roughly 40% increase in the rate of psychosis. And if we look at people who use cannabis frequently, they have essentially a doubled risk of having psychosis. However, again, chicken or the egg, which one is causing the other? It looks like, if you try to break it down, that cannabis use seems to increase the risk of developing psychosis later in life. However, it also seems to work the other way. People who suffer from psychotic episodes are more likely to use cannabis as a result. And so it seems like cannabis can cause psychosis, but that either the people who suffer from psychosis are using cannabis to self-medicate, or there's something else that links the two together. Whether that catechol O-methyltransferase polymorphism has a role in persistent psychosis is unclear. It seems like in some situations it might, in other situations it doesn't. But we have found other polymorphisms that do, in fact, correlate between cannabis use and psychosis. How they lead to that correlation, or if one causes the other, is unclear. It seems, looking at what these genes are, that maybe a more likely explanation is that one polymorphism causes cannabis use and causes psychosis, and the cannabis use and the psychosis actually aren't linked together themselves. And so one polymorphism causes both. Another explanation is that maybe these genes, these polymorphisms that we're looking at, are not causative at all, and rather they are marker genes. So if you haven't taken genetics, a marker gene is a gene that is located on a chromosome very near a gene that causes something else. It's very near the causative gene. And when we look at inheritance of genes, what we're really looking at is inheritance of chunks of chromosomes. And so someone that inherited a gene that is causative of something, it's very likely that they inherited a gene that is nearby also. And so in this situation, it's possible that we've discovered the marker genes, we simply haven't discovered the causative gene that is nearby. What about cannabis use during adolescence and its role in causing psychosis later in life? There have been several studies that have shown this to be the case, and this is most likely the case, that if you use cannabis during adolescence, you're increasing the risk of developing psychosis later in life. Again, we don't know the mechanism for certain here. It is very possible that cannabis use affects brain development. Remember, we talked about in the endocannabinoid lecture that the endocannabinoid system plays a very, very important role in neural development. And so, if you have a person who does not have a fully developed central nervous system, and they start introducing exogenous cannabinoids, it's hard to believe that that is not going to have an effect. Another way to look at this, though, is that if people start smoking or consuming cannabis earlier in life, most likely, by the time they are adults, they will have consumed more cannabis than someone who started consuming cannabis when they were an adult. And so really, the way to look at this is to find people who had large consumption while they were an adolescent, but don't consume it at all as an adult. That is a hard population to find, and so far there haven't been any good studies that have been able to tease that out. Unfortunately, there are no good animal models of psychosis, and so we can't simply run animal experiments and look at these things. Because if we could, then we could easily do that. We could give cannabis or THC to adolescent mice or rats, and then withdraw that, and simply wait and see if they develop psychosis later in life. However, we don't have a good way of measuring psychosis in animals, and we don't have a good model of causing psychosis in animals other than other experimental ways, such as giving them cannabis. And so we just don't have the setups, the mechanisms to test this. Hopefully in the future we will. So far we've focused on THC and just cannabis use in general. But what about CBD? If we look at cannabis strains, we see that some strains cause more psychosis than others. And we've already talked about how old strains of cannabis were low THC in fairly high amounts of CBD, whereas newer strains are high THC and low CBD. And so it's not a stretch to think, well, maybe the strain of cannabis is determining how psychotic it is. And that's likely the case, because if we look at humans and we look at psychosis caused by THC, if we then give that person CBD, we can reverse those effects. Not only that, but if we give CBD to these people that are suffering from psychosis, it works as well as an FDA-approved antipsychotic drug, amisulpride. But amisulpride and other current antipsychotic medications are very dangerous. They have a lot of side effects. Maybe dangerous isn't the right word, but they have a lot of side effects. And these side effects, because they're dealing with brain function, can be very, very debilitating. They can be life-changing. They can limit what a person is capable of doing, what they're allowed to do. And so CBD seems to work as well as current FDA-approved drugs, but we know that CBD is very, very safe. It does not have neurological or brain side effects. So that's the end of that. Obviously, there's a lot of questions here. We don't have many answers, and there's a lot left to figure out. And so I wish I could give you more information, but there just isn't all that much out there.